Welcome to Mastering Modern Media Playback. My name is Stefan Hafenegger. I'm an engineer on the AV-Kit team. If you're already using or planning to adopt AV-Kit or AV Foundation in your iOS or OS X applications, this is the right session for you. The goal of this session is to show you how easy and powerful media playback is on iOS 8 and OS X Yosemite. We have more sessions focused on other media operations later today and this week, and we will refer you to those at the end of this talk. In the first part of this talk, I'm going to introduce you to AV-Kit for iOS and show you why and how you should use it in your applications. I will also give you a very brief overview of the most important API additions and changes in UI and behavior we have for you this year in AV-Kit for OS X. In the second part of this talk, my colleague Shalini Sahu will teach you best practices for using AV-Kit and the AV Foundation in your iOS and OS X applications. But before we dive in, let's take a quick look at our current media stack on iOS. On the lowest level, we have the core media framework, the core of our modern media stack. On top of core media sits AV Foundation, a powerful Objective-C framework that provides you easy access to our media stack. Finally, on the UI kit level, we have the media player framework with built-in UI, providing you playback UI in the form of MP Movie Player Controller. This year in iOS 8, we're adding a new framework called AV-Kit, replacing parts of the media player framework. AV-Kit is our new high-level media framework, providing you access to the rest of the media stack. And I'm going to show you in this talk what possibilities this opens up for your iOS applications. But to be clear, we're not deprecating MP Movie Player Controller in iOS 8, but we are strongly encouraging you to adopt AV-Kit for media playback instead. So here I have it, our modern media stack on iOS. For those of you with an OS X background, you might see that it's pretty similar to our media stack on OS X. And you're correct. In fact, it is the same now on both iOS and OS X, and will allow you to create and maintain cross-platform applications easier than ever. And now, let me introduce you to AV-Kit for iOS. So up to now, we've provided you two options for media playback on iOS: MP Movie Player Controller and its UI View Controller companion MP Movie Player View Controller, and AV Foundation. So some of you might be using MP Movie Player Controller in your applications, which means you get standardized playback UI, but you lack access to the media stack, which means you're limited to basic media playback. Or you might be using AV Foundation and thus have access to the media stack and can do things beyond basic media playback, but you have to implement your own playback user interface. Finally, some of you in the audience might be in the process of adding media playback to your applications and might be torn between these two options. We want to make your life as developers easier, and that's why we have something new for all of you. AV-Kit provides you both standardized playback controls and behaviors while giving you full access to the modern media stack through AV Foundation. Last year, we introduced AV-Kit on OS X. This year, we bring AV-Kit over to iOS. Our goal for AV-Kit on iOS is to provide you view-level facilities for media operations on top of AV Foundation and UI Kit. Media playback on iOS is now easier and more powerful than ever. AV-Kit on iOS ships with AV Player View Controller, a state-of-the-art Your View Controller subclass that provides you the same look and feel as our video applications and the existing MP Movie Player Controller API. And we made it really easy for you to adopt AV Player View Controller in your iOS applications. Let me show you the necessary steps in the demo. So in Xcode, we create a new iOS application, and we select the empty application template, and then press the Next button. As the name, we enter AV-Kit Player, press Next again, save the project on the desktop. Now, we select the app delegate implementation, and the first thing we have to do is to import AV Foundation and AV-Kit. Then, the application did finish launching with options. We first create an AV Player view controller by calling AV Player view controller alloc init. And then we create an AV Player object by calling AV Player with URL. And then we use ns-bundle main bundle URL for resource with extension. And the resource name is going to be longboarding and the extension MOV. We set the player object on the AV Player view controller. And then we set the AV Player view controller as the root view controller of our window. Finally, we add the movie to our project. And if we now build and run, you can see we have a fully functional playback application. And this was just 3 lines of code, basically. But this example is probably not what your application would look like. So let's switch to a different project. Let me first run this and show you what it is. So this is a very simple media playback application, or sorry, movie library application. And it's using the master detail view controller template. So in the master view here, we have a list of movies. And for each of the movie, we have the thumbnail, the name of the file, and some information. When I now click one of the movies, you see that in the detail view, we have some information about the movie and this gray box here. So in the rest of this demo, I'm now going to add AV Player view controller and show you how to hook it up. So we start by modifying the main storyboard. As you can see here, I already have a container view. So now in the object library, we search for the player view controller, drag in an instance to our storyboard. Move this over here a bit. And then using a control drag and choose embed, we can set the AV Player view controller up for our container view. Now we need to select the segue, and the inspector, give it an identifier. In this case, we just use show movie. Since we are using AV Player view controller in the storyboard, we also have to manually link against the AVKit library or framework. So for linked framework and libraries, we add a new framework. So we type in AVKit, select it, and then press the Add button. And now we have to modify the detail view controller implementation. Again, the first thing we have to do is to import the header files. So we do import AV Foundation and add import AVKit. And then we need to implement the prepare for segue sender implementation. So first, we check for the identifier. We want to make sure that it is show movie. Then we get the AV Player view controller, which is the destination view controller of the segue. And then finally, we create an AV Player the same way as we did before by using player with URL. And this detail view controller has a movie property, which itself has a URL. And then we set this AV player object on the player view controller. We now build and run. And select a movie. You can see that the movie is loaded here, and we can press play. And we press the full screen button. It goes into full screen, and we can rotate to landscape. And you can see it's fully working. All right. So next I want to show you how AV Player view controller works in AV Foundation, especially for those of you in the audience that are new to AV Foundation. AV Player view controller holds a strong reference to an AV Player object. This object provides the content. An AV Player object manages an AV Player item, which serves as a mutable data structure from immutable AV asset. This means in order to provide content for an AV Player view controller, you have to do the following steps. First, create an AV asset from an NS URL. This URL can either be a local file on disk or a remote URL. With an AV asset, you then create an AV Player item. Once you have an AV Player item, you can create an AV Player object. And finally, you associate the AV Player object with the AV Player view controller. But if you don't need to inspect any properties yourself of the content and just want to play it with AV Player View Controller, you can do all 4 steps at once. As I've shown you in the demo, you can directly create an AV Player object from an NSURL and then pass it to the AV Player View Controller. And there's a chance that the only reason why you inspected the AV asset so far was in order to implement your own playback user interface. With AV Kit, you don't have to do this anymore. So if you would take a look at the AV Player View Controller API, you might notice that besides the player property, there isn't really much more. But there's so much stuff you just get automatically without any further setup. Here's a list of the most important AV Player View Controller features for your reference. You might notice that it is mostly identical to MP Movie Player Controller. And there's a reason for that. We want to make your transition to AV Kit as easy as possible. For those of you not familiar with MP Movie Player Controller, let me show you what these features actually look like. AV Player View Controller has adaptive playback controls. This is different from MP Movie Player Controller and AV Player View on OS X. Instead of setting a certain control style, AV Player View Controller automatically adapts the control style for you. So as you saw in the demo, when you show a movie embedded in your application and the user taps the full screen button, AV Player View Controller automatically switches to the full screen playback controls. If you don't want to show any controls at all, you still have the option to hide them. AV Player View Controller also has dynamic playback controls. So for content with chapters, tapping the seek backward or seek forward button seeks to the previous or next chapter. For content with additional languages or subtitles, AV Player View Controller adds a media selection button, allowing the user to select a different audio or subtitle track. Dynamic also means that AV Player View Controller automatically switches to a different set of playback controls for live streaming content. You don't have to do anything. Finally, AV Player View Controller has built-in support for both AirPlay and HDMI. So when a user enables AirPlay or plugs in an HDMI adapter, the application will automatically present the content on the external screen by keeping the playback controls on the iOS device. So let's see how AV Player View Controller stands up against MP Movie Player Controller so far. Every major feature is available in AV Kit as well. But if you look closely, you will notice one difference. As I mentioned before, AV Player View Controller automatically selects the control style for you. So there's less for you to worry about. But actually, there's a lot more. Let's take a look at the object diagram from earlier for a bit. If you want to replace the current AV Player item, you typically use replace current item with player item on AV Player. But if you already know in advance what the next item is going to be, you can help AV Foundation, and AV Foundation can help you to get smooth playback when switching to the next player item using AVQ Player. AVQ Player is a subclass of AV Player that allows you to enqueue a list of AV Player items, each of which is backed by an AV asset. Everything I'm showing you today about AV Player View Controller works just fine with AVQ Player as well. So far, I've just talked about basic media playback. With AV Foundation, you can do a lot more. AV Composition is a subclass of AV asset and allows you to create multi-clip and multi-track media compositions. As a result, it is heavily used in our and possibly some of your video editing applications. It doesn't matter if you provide AV Player View Controller, an AV Player item backed by an AV asset, or an AV Composition. Either works fine. AV Composition is also your entry point to even more advanced features. For instance, AV Video Composition allows you to apply affine transforms and simple transitions for video content. But you can even create your own custom compositors to create all kinds of video effects. AV Audio Mix provides you similar functionality for audio tracks. AV Video Composition and AV Audio Mix work in combination with AV Composition. you want to analyze, modify, or visualize raw audio data during playback, you can use Empty Audio Processing tab. These are just a few classes that AV Foundation provides you for media operations beyond basic media playback. If you want to learn more about this topic, check out our previous WWDC sessions, like this one from last year, and related sample code. Let's take a look again at our list of AV Player Viewer Controller features. So as I've shown you in this talk, AV Player View Controller has the same features as MP Movie Player Controller. But due to the full access to AV Foundation, you get so much more. Let me show you what you can easily do now with AV Foundation, AV Kit in your own iOS applications. So this is an iPad version of the movie library application that I used earlier to show you how to use AV Player View Controller. In this demo, I can now add video effects to movies. As you can see, I added a hue curve effect to this movie. Right now, the effect is zero impact. But once I start dragging handles up or down, you can see how I can change certain hue values in the movie. Each handle represents a hue value on the color wheel, and changing a handle modifies that color or shifts that color to a different value. I can scrub to any frame in the movie to adjust the values. So here the helmet, for instance. But let's scrub back to the beginning and start playing. So as you can see, the video effect is applied in real time. And on the right, I even added a digital volume meter that shows you the volume for the left and right audio channel during playback. In order to do all of this, the application is using the AV Foundation Composition API that I mentioned before. AV Kit continues to manage the user interface, just as it does for basic media playback cases. Thank you. So now that I've shown you how easy it is to adopt AV Player View Controller in a new application, and what amazing things you can do in combination with AV Foundation, I hope you can't wait to adopt AV Player View Controller in your existing applications. In order to help you with the transition, I'm going to highlight the necessary steps for the 3 common scenarios. In the first scenario, you're using AV Player Layer and possibly implemented your own playback user interface. Start off by replacing your AV Player Layer backed UI view and your user interface, or your playback user interface, with AV Player View Controller's view. Then set the player property on AV Player View Controller instead of AV Player Layer. And there's a chance that most of your remaining code will stay unchanged, unless you have some special UI needs. If you're using MP Movie Player View Controller, just replace MP Movie Player View Controller alloc init with content URL by AV Player View Controller alloc init, and then create and associate the AV Player object like I've shown you before. However, if you're also accessing the MP Movie Player Controller property, the third scenario also applies to you. So if you're using MP Movie Player Controller in your applications, you're dealing with a couple more properties and methods. But don't worry, the transition is actually quite straightforward. MP Movie Player Controller API can be grouped into 2 classes: view-specific API and controller-specific API. In the former case, you use AV Player View Controller API. In the latter case, AV Player and AV Player Item API. Things like MP Movie Error Log and MP Movie Access Log are actually very thin wrapper objects around AV Player Item Access Log and AV Player Item Error Log, for instance. There are 2 things you should watch out for, though. As I mentioned before, AV Player View Controller's control style is dynamic, so there's no settable property. Also, MP Movie Player Controller autoplays by default. AV Player does not do that. If there's anything you cannot do or do not know how to do with AV Kit and AV Foundation when switching over from MP Movie Player Controller, please talk to us in the labs or ask us in the developer forums. So let's wrap up AV Kit for iOS. In iOS 8, we're bringing AV Kit over from OS 10 is our new UI-level media framework for AV Foundation. AV Player View Controller provides you standardized playback controls and behavior while giving you full access to our powerful modern media stack. So please consider adopting AV Player View Controller in your iOS applications. Finally, I want to give you a brief update on AVKit for OS X. As you saw yesterday in the keynote, OS X Yosemite received the UI refresh, and as a result, we have a brand new UI for AVKit as well. If you're already using AV Player View, your applications will receive the new UI automatically. You don't have to change a single line of code or update any NIP file. If you're not using AV Player View yet, this might be a good time to adopt. With the introduction of AVKit for iOS, we're also updating some user interfaces and behaviors of AV Player View to match AV Player View Controller. If you want to learn more about how to use AV Player View, please check out last year's Moving to AVKit and AV Foundation session. And finally, we have a brand new class for you this year in AVKit for OS X. AV Capture View provides you view-level capture facilities on top of AV Foundation and AppKit. I'm not going into any details in this session, though. Please come to the camera capture talk tomorrow morning or ask us in the labs if this is interesting to you. And now, let me hand over to my fellow AV Foundation engineer to show you how you can get the most out of AVKit and AV Foundation in your iOS and OS X applications. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Good morning. I'm Shalini Sahu, an engineer on the AV Foundation team, and I'm here to talk to you today about best practices. Before we get into the details of these practices, for a show of hands, how many of you have used AV Foundation before? Lots of you. For you, I would hope this section serves as an update or refresher on best practices. As technology evolves with time, so do best practices. For those of you who are new to AV Foundation, I hope this serves as a guideline on how to approach our APIs. Let's get started by talking about why you would be interested in adopting such practices. What's the motivation? These practices are designed to make your application as efficient and performant as possible, making it responsive to your end users. They not only help with the application's efficiency, but also help improve your program correctness, making it robust, and preventing any sorts of hangs or crashes. Media applications sometimes make use of expensive resources like networks. These best practices are designed so that you can make efficient use of such resources. And lastly, your users will be thankful for the improvement they see in their battery life as your application uses very little power. Here's our modern media stack we looked at earlier in this talk. AV Foundation sits on top of CoMedia and its family of frameworks, and on top is AVKit, which provides you with standard playback controls with just few lines of code. The focus for this section today is best practices, specifically in the areas of inspection and playback. If you would like to gain more information about AV Foundation in general, you can look at this talk from WWDC 2011 called Exploring AV Foundation. Based on the two major categories for today, AV Foundation objects are modeled separately. For the first category, which is inspection, AV Asset is an example. With an AV Asset, as a client of this API, you are in charge of loading values whenever you need it in your application. You can initiate I/O, and when AV Foundation receives a request for I/O, we go and do all the loading work so you can get a value. The best practice here is to request values asynchronously. Why asynchronous loading? We'll answer that in just a few slides. For the other category, which is playback, AV Player and Player Item are the controller objects. All you have to do here is create these items and initiate playback. AV Foundation and its underlying machinery drive the playback clock so that your users see video frames on time. So when you hit play, we drive the necessary machinery so that your user can experience a smooth playback. As time progresses, properties change, and if you would like to keep your application state up to date with the state of the playback engine, you can use NS key value observing to be notified of such changes. NS key value observing is also called as KVO. Here's a look at our object diagram from earlier. Stefan showed you in a demo how to use these objects and create a simple media application. Now let's use this as our roadmap for talking about best practices class by class, starting with AV Asset. As I mentioned earlier, with AV Asset, you can use AV asynchronous key value loading, one of our protocol methods, which lets you load properties asynchronously before accessing them. For example, if you're interested in the precise duration of an asset, you can ask AV Foundation for the duration, and we download just about the right amount of data to be able to tell you what the duration is. With some file formats, it's straightforward, and there's summary information right up ahead, so we can download just that piece of data. But that's not always the case. Sometimes, when you ask us for duration, AV Foundation would have to download the entire contents of the media file, parse it, decode it, before we can give you the value for a precise duration. You might ask, why should I load asynchronously if AV Foundation has to do all this work to load values, or it takes time to load values? Well, you really should. On OS X, if you try to access a property synchronously by accessing a getter before loading the property, you would be blocking your main thread, leading to a spin and making your application unresponsive to your end user. On OS X, however, you can dispatch this work to a background queue to access the getter, and you won't see a spin. Whereas on iOS, loading synchronously from any thread would block your application and could lead to a hang or crash. This is because, as you may already know, on iOS, we have a shared daemon called Media Server D, which services media requests on behalf of your application. If you try to access a property synchronously, you would be tying Media Server D or forcing Media Server D to load a value, and this might take time. This leads to a timeout and media services termination. This not only affects your application, but every other application on the system which relies on media services. So please don't do that. Now that we looked at a good reason to use AV asynchronous key value loading, there are two more things to remember. Firstly, only load those properties you anticipate to use in your application. Every extra property means more work. If you intend to not use a particular property, do not incur the wasted work. And the second thing is, if you anticipate the use of a particular property later in your application, you can still request all of them together using load values asynchronously for keys and completion handler. You can pass in an array of keys which AV Foundation will load together, and your completion handler is called once we are done loading these properties. You no longer have to load tracks before playback begins. This has changed since the last time we talked about best practices. In fact, this has changed since iOS 5. You really only need to load those properties you would directly use in your application. Now let's look at how AV asynchronous key value loading translates into code. In this particular example, I'm interested in loading the property playable. I pass in an array with just playable in it, and I provide a completion handler. In my completion handler, I first check to make sure the property is loaded. Sometimes things go wrong, like if you're relying on the network resource and your user device goes out of range, asset loading can fail. So this is a good place to check for such errors. Once you get the status, you can see if it's already loaded, and then you can update your UI for the asset, or if there's a failure, you can report an appropriate error to your end user. One more thing to remember with completion handlers is, if another module has already loaded the keys you're interested in, your completion handler is called back immediately. Say in this example, if AV player has already loaded the playable property, your completion handler is called synchronously on the same thread. If you have code which relies on load values asynchronously for keys to return immediately, that might not happen till the completion handler has executed. So that's something to keep in mind to prevent a deadlock. To list the best practices for AV Asset, Load only those keys you're interested in using in your application. You can use AV asynchronous key value loading to list all these keys together in an array, and you can provide a completion handler, which is called once we are done loading these properties. In your completion handler, check to make sure the properties are loaded before you access them. And lastly, be prepared for a synchronous callback. If someone else has already loaded the property on your behalf, your completion handler is called back immediately. Those were best practices for AV Asset. Now let's look at AV Player and Player Item. As I mentioned earlier, with AV Player and Player Item, the playback engine, the underlying playback engine drives the machinery necessary so that your user sees video frames on time. So all you have to do is use NS Key Value Observing, or KVO, to be notified of such changes so that you can update your application state. Here's an example. If you have a progressive download item on an HTTP server, as AV Foundation downloads some data, you get a callback with the loaded range, and as we buffer more data, you get yet another callback with the updated value for the loaded range. A second example of where KVO might come in handy is playback interruption. If your user's device receives a phone call or FaceTime call when your application is playing a particular file, your playback is interrupted so that your user can answer their call. In this case, if you're using KVO on the player's rate, you would see it transition to 0. This is a good way for you to be notified of such interruptions so that you do not end up waiting endlessly for playback to end. And the last example here is media services reset. As I mentioned earlier, if your application or some other application wasn't paying attention to AV asynchronous key value loading and tried to access a property synchronously, you could have forced media server D to terminate. This affects your application too. Your media services are reset. And when this happens, your player item status transitions to failed. And this is a good place for you to throw away all your old objects and rebuild your player and player item to continue playback. Let's look at an example in code where KVO might come in handy. In this example, I would like to decide when to show audio-only UI in my application. Here, I first create a player item with an asset. Then I try to access the tracks property of an asset, particularly of type video. And then I check to make sure that there are no video tracks before I update my UI to audio only. This is not completely correct. Firstly, we're trying to access the tracks property on an asset without prior loading it. This could block your main thread and make your application unresponsive. And the second thing here is an assumption that lack of video tracks means audio only. You can have non-video visual tracks like subtitles in your movies. Now let's look at how I can do this using KVO. I add myself as an observer for the presentation size on a player item. And once AV Foundation is done loading the presentation size, in your observation callback, first check to make sure that your presentation size is 0 by 0. This way you know none of the tracks have a non-zero presentation size. And after that, make sure you have at least one audio track. To do that, you can look at the underlying AV asset tracks and make sure that there's at least one of them which has a AV media characteristic audible. This is necessary because sometimes you can have movie files which have 0 by 0 for the presentation size, but no audio tracks, like timecode tracks. The KVO recipe we just used, we first create a player item with an asset, then we register for key value observing a property of interest. After that, we associate the player item with the player. And in your observation callback, you can look at the change dictionary to know what the new value is. This is the recipe when you work with these objects. But there are a few more things to remember when you are interacting with these objects in general. First, do not assume the order in which events occur. As soon as you associate a player item with a player, AV Foundation starts its underlying machinery so that your user can experience a smooth playback. On iOS 7, we made an optimization which changes the status to ready to play much more quickly. So if you were to add yourself as an observer after you create a player with a player item, you could miss this vital notification. To fix this, you can add yourself as an observer before associating a player item with a player. That way, you wouldn't miss any notifications. Or sometimes in your applications, you might have a particular scenario where you would like to add yourself as an observer only after an event, say if a user presses a button. In such cases, you can use NSKeyValue observing option initial. This flag lets you access the initial value as well as the new value. The second thing to remember is that AV Foundation serializes the access to AV player and player item on the main queue. It's safe to access and register and unregister for observers for these objects on the main queue. This was done to prevent any possible race conditions, as multiple modules are interacting with these objects. And the main queue was a natural choice, as most of these observation callbacks lead to your application's interaction with UIKit objects, which also happen on the main queue. However, this does not mean that we are doing our work on our main queue. We are not affecting the end-user responsiveness. All our loading and playback-related work happens on the background queue. We only serialize the access to these objects on the main queue. If in your application you have a particular scenario for which you think this requirement is a hindrance, please come talk to us in our labs or file enhancement requests. We are really interested in listening to your feedback on this. And the last thing to remember is, wherever possible, set up your player item before associating it with a player. As I mentioned earlier, as soon as you create a player, AV Foundation starts driving its machinery so that we can get ready for playback. For example, if you have a streaming item, as soon as you create a player, we go over the network and start downloading data from the default time. And after that, if you were to issue a seek to time, we would have to throw away all the data we downloaded and start reloading our caches to begin playback. In order to prevent that, wherever possible, you can always configure your player item before associating it with the player. Here's a few examples of the kind of configurations you can do. This is definitely not the exhaustive list, but just a few. You can add outputs. You can select media options like audible and legible. You can set forward and reverse playback end times or seek to time. And after doing all those changes, I can associate my player item with the player. In summary, for AV player and player item, use NSKeyValue observing to be notified of changes as the playback engine is driving the clock so that your user can experience a smooth playback. Do not rely on the order in which events occur. If you really need a particular value, you can always use NSKeyValue observing option initial or add yourself as observers before you create a player. Please serialize your access to player and player item on the main queue to avoid any possible race conditions. And lastly, wherever possible, set up your player item with all configurations before creating a player. Those were the best practices for AV player and player item. Most of the things we talked about AV player also apply to AV queue player. As you've seen earlier in this talk, AV queue player takes a list of player items. If in your application you have an inspector window for which you would like to access a set of keys on each of the player items, you can use AV player items convenient initializer, which lets you parse a set of keys which AV queue player or AV player would load on your behalf. You have an AV queue player with a list of items, and if you initialize each of these items with a set of keys, as AV queue player is getting ready to initiate playback for a particular item, we load these keys in combination with the keys we require for playback. And as playback progresses and we reach the next item, we load the second set of keys you requested for that particular item. This is valid for AV player as well if you're using replace current item with player item. You can use this as an alternate to AV asynchronous key value loading. Instead of using AV asynchronous key value loading for each of your asset, you can initialize each of the player items, and we'll take care of loading the properties. And if you're using this instead of AV asynchronous key value loading, the best place to access your properties would be to KVO the player item status. When you receive an observation callback for the status, and if the status is ready to play, your asset keys would either be loaded or fail. So then you can use status of value for key to access these properties. And the last thing to remember with AV Queue Player is if AV Foundation encounters an error with a particular player item, we skip that item and move on so that your user experiences uninterrupted playback. However, if you would like to be notified of such errors, you can NS key value observe AV Queue Player's current item status. Those were some tips for using AV Queue Player. Lastly, let's talk about AV Player View Controller. With AV Player View Controller on iOS or AV Player View on OS X, it's a good idea to animate your view into your view hierarchy only when there's some viable content to present, only if there's some video frames you can show. And to do that, you can key value observe ready for display. On iOS, you would observe on the Player View Controller, whereas on OS X, you observe on the Player View. You add yourself as an observer for ready for display. And in your observation callback, you can check to make sure ready for display is yes before animating your view or before showing your view. New in iOS 8 and OS X 10.10 is Content Overlay View. With Content Overlay View, you can do your custom drawings and renderings over the player view. The Content Overlay View is guaranteed to have similar dimensions as the player view. And if you would like to place your drawings relative to the video frame, you can access the Video Bronze property on the Player View controller. Here's a screenshot of the demo we saw earlier. The digital volume meter on the bottom right was rendered using Content Overlay View. And lastly, for chapter navigation, as you may have seen in QuickTime Player, when you seek through chapters using the appropriate keyboard shortcuts or menu items, QuickTime Player briefly flashes the chapter number and title. And if you would like to get similar behavior in your applications, which we highly recommend, you can use this API of AV Player View, this is only on OS X, to flash chapter number and title. Ideally, you would do this after the seek has completed, so you can place this code in your completion handler for seek to time. So the best practices for Player View Controller is to observe ready for display to know when to present your view on screen, so that your user doesn't have to look at black screen. Second, then we saw how to use Content Overlay View to do custom rendering over the player view. In Z order, the player view is below, and above that is Content Overlay View, and the controls sit on top. And lastly, we saw how to flash chapter number and title during chapter navigation using AV Player View. That brings us to the end of our roadmap for best practices. Let's wrap up. We looked at why it's important to load values asynchronously and how to do that using AV asynchronous key value loading for AV asset. With AV Player and Player Item, all you have to do is use NS key value observing to be notified of changes. And we looked at some tips for using AV Queue Player. We talked about how to observe ready for display, to know when to present your view into your view hierarchy. And then we looked at how to customize your player view by custom drawings in Content Overlay View and displaying chapter numbers during navigation. That was best practices for AV Foundation and AV Kit, our last topic for today. In summary, AV Kit is now available on iOS along with OS X. AV Kit provides you with standard playback controls with just few lines of code. If you've been using AV Kit on OS X, you get the UI refresh for free. You wouldn't have to change anything. We looked at a demo which shows how powerful AV Foundation can be in combination with AV Kit to provide you with an application with standard playback controls and to add effects and visualizations. We highly recommend you to adopt our most modern media frameworks and to audit your current applications to see if they can stand to benefit by adopting these best practices. For more information, you can contact our evangelism team or check out our programming guide on our developer website, which covers both AV Foundation and AV Kit. You can also consult us on our developer forums. We have some related sessions lined up for you for the rest of this week, starting with one this afternoon called Harnessing Metadata in Audiovisual Media. Tomorrow morning, we show you camera capture with all its new features and AV capture view we mentioned earlier in this talk. And on Thursday, we show you how you can directly access our media encoders and decoders. That's it. Thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your week.